Perhaps the primary purpose of music theory is to explain why music sounds the way it does, and why similar works sound similar. We should, for example, be able to explain why the music of a composer like Stravinsky sounds like Stravinsky. This is more difficult than it appears to be. We often search for that one concept that will explain these musical similarities. We rarely find it. Dmitry Tomasko commented on this phenomenon in his article, Stravinsky and the Octatonic. Here, it seems to me, we come to the heart of the matter. Stravinsky's music always sounds characteristically Stravinskian, and therefore there should be some speciable characteristic that accounts for this. This, I believe, represents a fundamental misconception of the nature of musical style, one that has been abetted by some of the century's most prominent theorists. It is of a piece with the view that musical language is systematic and regular, a quasi-logical system that is grounded in a few surveyable principles. And it is the sort of view that naturally leads analysts to search for totalizing accounts of a composer's individual sound. I do agree that Stravinsky's music sounds characteristically Stravinskian, but I do not think that there need be any single explanation of why this is so. Similarly, I do not think that there is any non-complex explanation of why Mozart sounds like Mozart or Charlie Parker sounds like Charlie Parker. Instead, the unity that we perceive in Stravinsky's music may be the result of a multitude of disparate factors, which together constitute the Stravinsky sound. I am therefore proposing something more like a family resemblance, an explanation in which the perceived unity of Stravinsky's music is due to a cluster of different techniques, no one of which is truly central to the composer's style. It is in this spirit that I suggest we return to the familiar picture of Stravinsky as a pluralist, a bricoleur who used a variety of materials possessing no systematic unity, a man who knew many small musical tricks rather than a single large one. The phrase bag of tricks is often associated with Stravinsky's compositional process. It's usually used in a derogatory manner, implying that anyone who knew the secret to the tricks could achieve the same results as Stravinsky. The music of some 20th century composers can be seen as systematic and rigorous, based on a small number of profound logical principles. But perhaps it's not the tricks themselves or the profound logical principles, but rather how they are used that matters. Take modulation. It could be a profoundly logical principle, a primary means of structuring a piece, or it could just be one of the tricks in the bag. Beethoven demonstrated this with the opening of his Fourth Piano Concerto. In an early sketch of the concerto, the opening is a conventional antecedent-consequent phrase. The piano opens with the antecedent phrase, the orchestra answers with the consequent. By the time of publication, the passage was transformed. The antecedent is the same, but the consequent phrase now starts on a major mediant. This is a direct modulation, reinforced by a 5-to-1 in the mediant key B major. This modulation also requires that Beethoven lengthen the phrase in order to secure a modulation back to tonic at the end of the phrase. The magic of this modulation is the result of its unexpectedness and of the introduction of the colorful mediant relationship. Beethoven's use of modulation hardly follows a profound principle, but it is a very good trick. It transforms a serviceable but mundane musical passage into a magical one. It would perhaps be more honest if I used some examples from my own music. While I can speculate about why Beethoven might have altered the passage in the Fourth Concerto, I can't really speak to his motivation. With my own music, I can. I'm going to include some examples from my own piece, Hymn Tunes 8. It's now known as In Dulce Jubilo. It's based on Elizabethan melodies, many of them associated with Christmas. Elizabethan music tends to be modal and contrapuntal, and often has a kind of an austere quality. A few years after composing the piece, I transcribed it for band, hoping for some new performances. When I listened to the piece, I found it too austere, even boring. I decided it needed a massive revision, and this would entail dipping into my bag of tricks. Since the piece was already written, these tricks would be used to add character, to spice it up a little bit, rather than to create new musical material. My first concern was with the melodic material itself. While it was modal, it somehow didn't seem modal enough. Much of the lack of modal flavor was due to a preponderance of leading tones. I went through the piece and changed many of these to lowered sevenths. I also decided to change much of the diatonic writing to pentatonic. To me, pentatonic melodies tend to be more colorful than diatonic ones. I'm particularly fond of pentatonic scales based on Mixolydian and Lydian. In both cases, the removal of the third and sixth scale degrees from the traditional modes creates colorful, evocative scales. One unusual characteristic of these pentatonic scales is the inclusion of a minor second. In the Mixolydian one, it's between 3 and 4 above tonic, and in the Lydian one, between 4 and 5. I have found that I can create minor versions of these scales by placing a minor third below their tonics. This gives me a vocabulary of modes that maintains a consistent quality. Much of the ancillary material in my piece was altered so that it conforms to one of these modes. The original Elizabethan melodies, now with modal alterations, can be made to fit with the pentatonic scales, with the addition of pien tones added in the gaps of the pentatonic scales. When I want the music to be more dense, more chromatic, I usually make use of the octatonic scale. This works out particularly well when I want to move into the octatonic from the Lydian pentatonic. I usually use two forms of the Lydian pentatonic, one based on the regular Lydian mode, the other based on the Lydian dominant scale, a Lydian scale with a lowered seventh. Since the Lydian dominant scale is a subset of the octatonic scale, it's easy to slip back and forth between them. Using all of these different scales might seem complicated, but it's not. I simply pick out a scale to use based upon its quality, its effect. Mixolydian pentatonic's my normal sound. The Lydian pentatonic is used when I want a brighter sound. I use the Lydian dominant pentatonic when I want lowered sevenths. I place a minor third below these scales to get a darker sound, and I transform them into octatonic when I want a more chromatic sound. Ever since I learned about chord scale theory in college, I've been concerned with fitting keys and modes over individual chords, rather than entire sections of a piece. So in order to use these scales, I pick the scale I want to use and transpose its pitches so that they complement the chord that is happening at any given moment. The opening of the piece turned out to be really problematic. The piece starts out with a theme from In Nomine by John Bull. This theme embodies all that is weird and wonderful in Renaissance music, and it does it in 11/4 to boot. The problem is that the sober modal effect of this melody doesn't quite suit the modality of the rest of the piece. The solution to this problem was to start the piece with an ostinato that would function as a counter melody to Bull's theme. The countermelody is based on the Mixolydian pentatonic scale on F. This presents the characteristic modal quality of the piece from the very beginning. The bowl theme never quite destroys that modality. When it does conflict with the ostinato, it does so in a kind of polymodal way, as a kind of temporary chromaticism. Instead of leaving the harmonies diatonic in the Renaissance modes, I changed the harmonies to conform to my own harmonic practice. I learned a long time ago that root movement between chords really doesn't matter much to me. What matters to me is the quality of the chord. So instead of picking chords by function, I pick them by quality. If I want a bright sound, I use a major chord. If I want a dark sound, I use a minor triad. I'm also concerned with freshening up the harmonic context from time to time. If I'm looking to emphasize a certain note in the melody, or if I feel the passage is becoming stale, I will choose a chord that's outside the key, often way outside the key. This does tend to get the audience's attention and allows the composer to highlight certain notes in the melody. This non-functional way of looking at chords could be applied to older music. I often wonder if we really hear secondary dominance as creating a new temporary key center. My music theory students are constantly telling me that it doesn't make any sense to them to call a major supertonic chord a 5 of 5. To them, the chord just sounds like a quality shift and not a temporary shift of tonic. Given the current state of my musical ears, I'm inclined to agree with them. If you add the seventh to the secondary dominant, it becomes much stronger, and it does a better job of tonicizing the dominant. Except when it doesn't. Here's Richard Strauss taking a 5-7 of 5 to a tonic chord. It sounds like a major supertonic to me, even with the seventh. Since supertonic chords are major in the Lydian mode, this chord sounds to me like a modal shift rather than a temporary tonicization. I gave up thinking about modulation as a structural force a long time ago. For that reason, much of my early music doesn't include much modulation. Let me clarify. Many music theorists believe that modulation, or maybe a better word is key structure, is the primary way of structuring a piece. They believe that tonic is the primary key of the piece, and that going away from it and coming back to it determines the fundamental form of a work. I guess I do see modulation as being an important structural force, but only on the local level. You can use modulation to designate an important structural point in a piece, but you can also mark these points in other ways. You don't have to mark important structural points with modulation. Before I started teaching an analysis class, I didn't spend much time with late Romantic music. Because of this, I didn't really appreciate the dramatic power of modulation, particularly sequential modulation. In a previous video on modulation, I discussed the sequential modulation used by Dvorak to come out of the development in the first movement of the New World Symphony. I used a similar sequential modulation in Hymn Tunes 8, based on The Bells by William Byrd. Here's the original version without the sequential modulation. And here it is with the modulation. What I have done is to move an entire block of measures up a step, and then the next block up a step, and so on until a stable key is established at the entrance of the hymn tune in Dolce Jubilo. One of the things that bothers me about contemporary concert music is that its rhythm is often four square. This doesn't bother me with most early 20th century music. Stravinsky and Bartók had wonderfully flexible senses of rhythm. Rhythm doesn't even bother me in most classical music. Haydn and Beethoven had different rhythmic sensibilities than I do, but they both produced a lively and fluid rhythmic structure. In my own case, my rhythmic role models come out of jazz as well as the classical world. While I certainly learned a lot about rhythm from Stravinsky, my current rhythmic role model is jazz pianist McCoy Tyner. While Tyner probably didn't invent the techniques that he uses, he certainly perfected them. A good example is found in his piece, Reaching Forth. His rhythms never fall squarely on the beat. They never clobber it. Instead, they dance around it. That's the kind of rhythmic feel I want for my music. I want a rhythm that's teetering on the edge, but never falls. Take a look at the original version of Hymn Tunes 8 based on a tune by John Bull. That seems rhythmically dead to me. It's like the rhythm is being dragged through the mud. I completely rewrote the section so that the rhythm danced around the beat. Here's how that section turned out. The most difficult revision I made occurred at a significant tempo change. The previous part of the piece, based on the Coventry Carol, is in a slower tempo, and the new section, based on a John Bull melody, is in a much faster tempo. In the old version of the piece, I just stopped and restarted. I've never felt that this was satisfactory. The form of the piece is a wedge. It starts low and slow and soft. It gradually becomes higher, faster, and louder. Having it stop dead to change tempos breaks the momentum of the piece. I would rather have it flow continuously from one section to another. After trying numerous strategies, I hit upon the idea of using a metric modulation. Here's an example of a metric modulation. Set up a tempo in 3/4. Play triplets on each beat. Those triplets become the beats in a 6/8 measure. The eighth notes in the 6/8 measure become eighth notes in a new 3/4 measure. The last 3/4 measure is in a faster tempo than the first 3/4 measure. The tempo has been changed, both drastically and precisely. The relationship that I needed to get the tempo increase I was looking for was that 2 eighth notes of an eighth note triplet would need to equal 2 regular eighth notes in a new tempo. This sounds pretty easy to achieve, but I had a hard time working it out. I wanted a build up with lots of fast notes going into the new section. I let some of them, groups of 4/16 notes, hang over and fade away as the new section begins. This pattern starts out as a group of 6/16 note tuplets. The pattern then shifts to 4-note groups within the 16th note sextuplets, and these finally become the 16th notes in the new tempo. This is all based on the pattern outlined above. An eighth note triplet, the first 2 notes of the eighth note triplet, that then becomes 2 eighth notes in the new tempo. To make the introduction of the triplets seem less sudden, I hint at them earlier in the passage, and I add quarter note triplets right before the transition. Here's the entire metric modulation. So having a bag of musical tricks involves more than just collecting a bunch of musical materials. It also involves seeing the relationships between them and learning how to apply them. These examples also demonstrated the importance of revision. We have this romantic notion that composers create masterpieces in flashes of inspiration. This has rarely been the case. Writing a worthwhile piece has usually required many hours of composition and numerous revisions.